So we're here to talk about cookies. I'm Keegan Rodgers, founder and pastry chef at the Lakehouse Bakery. We've been in business for this is the tail end of our 6th year, and I can't even believe it's been that long. It's been so much fun and a wild ride. It's been great. But Aaron and I figured out a while back that we've been doing classes here for about, 10 years, 11 years now? So it's been, talk about a wild ride. I love librarians. They're the bomb. They're the best. I've been in food for 35 years. I love everything about food because it's food, right? Chocolate, butter, sugar, 3 of my 4 main food groups. So if after class, if you've got some questions beyond cookies, let me know. If you have a question about cookies while we're doing it, please ask. We're going to dive into the wonderful world of cookies. So what is a cookie? Well, we're going to find out. We're going to talk about what a cookie is, types of cookies. How many types of cookies do you think there are? Not like variety of cookie, but types of cookie, like classifications. We got 3, 10, closer to 10, believe it or not. There's quite a few. We're going to look at characteristics. We're going to talk about how to mix cookies. Because one of the things I've found in my 35 years is that with cooking, you've got this many ingredients, right? Like the whole wide world of ingredients. But really only this many ways to do something with it. Fry, saute, broil, right? Barbecue. But with baking and pastries, you've got this many ingredients and this many ways to do something with it. And cookies are unbelievably complex. And we'll talk about that. And we'll go into some of the mixing methods and what you can do to help make sure your cookies are more successful, especially now that it's cookie season. All right? Christmas cookies are the bomb. We'll talk about some ingredients and then tips and tricks on how to be successful. And like I said, as we're going along, please stop and ask questions. All right, so a cookie technically is a small sweet cake, typically round and flat, having a crisp or chewy texture. Now, chewy and crispy are 2 characteristics of cookies. There's a couple of others. And people have their preferences, right? Like depending on what type of cookie I'm eating will depend on what texture I would assume it to have. Like a chocolate chip cookie, for example, America's favorite, should have a crisp edge, but still chewy in the center. Not too cakey, right? And have the right proportion of chips. There actually is such a thing. I would say it's 80% because I love chocolate. But if you have that many chocolate chips in your cookie, then they won't really work as a cookie. So there's a lot of chemistry going on in cookies, and we'll see that today. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 types of cookies. Drop, icebox, bar, sheet, cut out, pressed, and piped, although technically we could say that's 2 separate, so we could say 9 types of cookies, but I gathered them together because they're very similar in structure. Rolled and wafer. And I bet every one of us have had every one of these types of cookies at one point in our life. Fortunately. Right? Because they're cookies. So let's start with drop cookies. This is the one that most of us start learning how to make, typically with grandma or mom in the kitchen when we're little ones. They're fairly easy to make. No real shaping skills involved. There is a bit of skill involved in the actual mixing of the dough, but they're varied in texture. Like the difference between a snickerdoodle, because a snickerdoodle generally is not going to be too crispy on the edge. It's going to be very cakey, very puffy. So it's different than a chocolate chip cookie. Variety of ingredients. Peanut butter cookies, for example. Oatmeal raisin cookies. Right? Butterscotch cookies. They're very distinct in the shape in that you'll notice that they all have the same basic look. Right? You know a drop cookie when you see one. And that's the beauty in a drop cookie. They could be, this big around, or they could be this big around. Now, the big cookies that you buy at the mall store, those are supposed to be a drop cookie, but they actually put those in a pan because you can't get a drop cookie that big very easily. But that's really, drop cookies are the simplest of all of the cookies to make, but there's still a lot of chemistry going on. All right. Icebox. Now, they're called icebox cookies because back in the day, they had to go in the icebox to be chilled before they could be cut and then baked. They're a fairly high sugar cookie, so not just a sugar cookie, but fairly high in sugar content. And it does have to be chilled. It's also higher in fat, so butter and sugar, two of, again, my 4 food groups. They are very uniform in shape, unlike a drop cookie, because a drop cookie could be a little amoeba-ish, right? But with an icebox cookie, it is very precise. It is very distinct in how it looks. It's very distinct in the shape. And again, you know an icebox cookie when you see one. Anybody make icebox cookies regularly? They're so good. And the roll of dough that you get in the store technically is an icebox cookie, but it's supposed to be a drop cookie. But because it's chilled and you slice it and you bake it, that makes it an icebox cookie. Versatile flavors, anything from chocolate, vanilla, cocoa, peanut butter, anise, any flavor you could possibly want in an icebox cookie. I've seen saffron icebox cookies. Rose petal, I've seen cardamom rose. That was a really interesting cookie. I enjoyed it. Those tend to be very thin. So again, not as much cakiness to them. So fairly thin, which makes them more on the crispy side. So they wouldn't necessarily be a chewy cookie like a chocolate chip. They would be more crispy all around, middle and edges. And they're very striking in terms of their visual appeal. And you'll see what I mean, right? The checkerboards, you could do the pinwheels. Most icebox cookies are going to be of the shortbread variety. Again, a higher fat with a higher sugar, not creamed as much, and we'll get into what that is and that process in a minute. But these are icebox cookies. I like the ones with the sprinkles all around because that looks very festive and fun. Bar cookies. You didn't know brownies were a cookie, did you? It's classified as a cookie. And brownies are one of those ones that I like them fudgier, but then it's because it's chocolate. But I know, like, my girlfriend likes them cakier, which is okay if I've got a frosting on it, but I prefer them fudgier because, like, fudge brownies, right? There's just something about that gooiness. Bar cookies generally are multi-layered. So lemon bars, dream bars, anything with like a shortbread or a short crust base, sometimes a caramel filling, and then something else on top. Those are classified as bars. It's still a cookie. They're fairly easy to serve because you can cut them out whatever size you want. You can make them smaller. You can make them fairly big. 2 by 2 is a general guideline for a size on a bar, whether it's a brownie or a lemon bar, which, like, doesn't that just look yum, those lemon bars? I do love lemon bars. So I'm going to point out, so that you see the powdered sugar on top? I lied, it's not powdered sugar. Powdered sugar melts when it gets wet. So if you've ever made lemon bars and sprinkled powdered sugar on them, and then like 5 minutes later went back, and you're like, well, wait a minute, where's the powdered sugar? I just put that on there. And you put more on there, and 5 minutes later, it's still gone. That's because powdered sugar melts when it gets wet. You need to use what's called donut sugar. That's the industry name for it. You can find it specialty stores, and of course the Amazon has it. But it's not actually sugar, it's glucose. Sugar is sucrose, and the donut sugar is glucose, and it will not melt when it gets wet. So if you ever go to a donut shop, which I do love donuts, right? Powdered sugar donuts. It's not powdered sugar, it's powdered glucose. And it's a specially formulated sugar so that it stays, so that when you eat it, it falls all over the front of you. That's what it's designed to do. So that you tell on yourself, because you should have brought one for the rest of the class, right? But that's what they put on the top of the lemon bar to give that tart, sweet combination, so it's not powdered sugar. Yeah, pretty straightforward. Sheet cookies. Easy, uniform, thin, fairly thin cookies. Large batch friendly, which is really nice. So what's really helpful is you could take a drop cookie and press it into a sheet pan, and you have a sheet cookie, right? So, and we'll talk about the difference between a sheet cookie and a bar cookie in a second, because I know that's what you're thinking. See, I knew that. The nice thing also is if you take your chocolate chip cookie dough or your peanut butter cookie dough or your oatmeal raisin cookie dough and put it into a sheet, you could then top it with a variety of things. Drizzle some caramel over it, put some frosting on it, some ganache. It's still a sheet cookie, but you've just added a little bit of flair to it, which is great. And then depending on the type of cookie that you're using would make it either cakier, chewier, fudgier. See where I'm going? It also depends on how thick it is. So the difference between them is the preparation. So one of the differences. They're made by spreading a thick batter for the bar cookie into a smaller baking pan, and then they're cut into individual bars or squares. Whereas sheet cookies, it's a thinner layer over a larger sheet pan. So think, an 8 by whatever versus 9 by 13. The texture and thickness, bar cookies are usually thicker. Also, because they're multi-layered, they tend to be thicker, whereas the sheet cookies tend to be crispier and thinner. Again, even if you put something on it, like a drizzle of caramel, it's still not going to be as thick as, say, a lemon bar. The ingredients and the layering, just kind of touched on that. So there's one of the other differences. So like brownies, right? If you do a cheesecake brownie, yum. That's still going to be a little bit thicker and allows for the layers in the same pan, whereas the sheet cookie is just going to be a little bit thinner. And typically single layer, even with a topping on it. And then serving. They can be about the same. Serving's a little bit more flexible. I would say that's one of the things they have in common. But that's the difference between a bar cookie and a sheet cookie. Next, we've got cutouts, and this is the time of year for cutouts, right? This is when everybody gets all their old ancient cutouts and uses them for Christmas deck cookies, and that's why I'm a pastry chef. Christmas cookies with Gran. When I was, I may have been that tall, but probably not. I was probably that big. The nice thing about cutouts is they will always be a uniform shape, because you're using a cutter, to cut them whatever shape it happens to be. They can be any size. I've seen them fairly small. I've seen them fairly large. Erin and I she had an event a while back. Remember these, Erin? We did sarcophagus cookies. Like, you name the shape, there's a cutter for it. I'm not kidding. Numbers, letters, whatever you want. The sarcophagus actually had 3 shapes in one, so you had to have, it was like a multi-layered kind of a thing. It was pretty interesting. It was that smell and tell. Remember that, Erin? That? Yes. Yeah, so the lady, there was a smell and tell on mummies, and apparently mummies smell like ginger. So we did the cookie base with ginger in it, right? And I remember the weirdest things, so. But it's a sarcophagus. How could you not forget a sarcophagus cookie? They were pretty good. Because they're uniform shape, they also tend to be fairly crisp throughout. They're also a uniform thickness, or should I say thinness, right? They tend to be fairly thin, less than 1/4 of an inch, typically. Any firmer than that or any thicker than that, then you'll break a tooth, right? They'll be just too hard to try and chew easily. And the idea is to get people to enjoy your cookies. So you go 1/8 of an inch-ish. If you're not comfortable rolling out and using your rolling pin, you can get their silicone like rubber bands that are set, and you can put them on the end of your rolling pin, and that way you roll to that thickness every time. It's like training wheels, and they're super easy to get. Again, most cake decorating places, some like Sur La Table or Williams-Sonoma, and of course the Amazon will have them. So, and I'm going to talk for a second about rolling pins. Does anybody in the room have a marble rolling pin? I'm not even going to raise my hand because I don't. If you've got one, display it beautifully on your wall. That's where it belongs. Marble rolling pins are too cold, and they're also too heavy. You ever pick up a marble rolling pin? Those suckers have some weight. And they're too heavy for you to comfortably do what you want, which is evenly roll out the cookie dough. And if it's not comfortable or easy for you to do, chances are you're not going to do it. That's just human nature. So get a rolling pin. It doesn't have to be very expensive. You go to the dollar store and get a rolling pin. Hold it in your hands, and I hold my thumbs up because you're going to hold it in your hands. You're going to take your thumbs and you're going to spin. And you're going to see how long the rolling pin spins. If it spins pretty easily for 10 seconds or so, that's a good rolling pin. Now you could spend a lot of money. I've seen some as much as $100. Maple have ball bearings inside of them, like really but you don't need that. I've actually used something like a wine bottle before. I mean, it was empty, right? But you know, anything that's a uniform shape that you can easily roll, as long as you can control what you're rolling. Now, the dough should be fairly soft when you're rolling. You absolutely don't want it too hard, too chilled. If it's too cold, you'll tend to overwork the gluten as you're rolling it out, and you'll also kind of really stretch it, and you want it to roll nice and easy. The number one thing I'm thinking of are like roll-out sugar cookies, but then also gingerbread. And the thing you want to be very careful with is, you know, make a large batch and then pull off a section of the dough, roll that out, and then when you bring the scraps back together, add some dough from the batch that you have left over. Don't try and roll it all out at once, because chances are you don't have that much counter space. And then the other thing that does is by adding in some of the dough that hasn't been rolled already, you're kind of refreshing the dough scraps so that you're not overworking the gluten on those pieces, because you're going to have to add some flour to the countertop, and you don't want to use too much flour because that will give you a really tough cookie. Sorry, I couldn't resist. And then once you're done rolling out, then of course, depending on the type of dough that it is, some cookie doughs are very, very persnickety, gingerbread especially, that if you, like any bump or caveat that you push on the cutter, that's how it's going to come out in the oven. They typically don't have much spread at all. So whatever you cut and you put it on the bowl on your sheet pan, that's how it's going to come out. And if you're decorating for Christmas, if you're using something like royal icing, you would decorate it when it comes out and is cooled. You could use candies, the nonpareils. These are bad examples. But okay, so the sprinkles. Like you could just put the sprinkles on the cookie and then bake it. As a kid, we had the colored sugar, which you can make. Don't buy that. Make it. And I'll tell you how in a second. Nonpareils, the little silver balls, the the different colors. You know, they're called Jimmy's, the longer. There's a cake supply place in Jackson called Cake Connection that I swear has like 6,000 different kind of sprinkles. They have flamingo-shaped sprinkles, but they don't have frogs. I don't remember why I was looking for frogs, but they didn't have frogs, but they had flamingos. You name it, they've got it. So, and those are designed to go on the cookie before you bake it. This is fondant. I am not a fan of fondant. It's a pain in the butt to work with, and it's not very tasty. And on a cake, people typically peel it back and then eat the cake, and then you end up with fondant, so we don't even use it. But it does the same thing. It holds its shape very well, so you can get some really great details on things. I'm not that patient, I'll be honest. But you don't have to use that. You could use royal icing. But so see on this one, so they took the snowflake out of this one and put it on that one. So you can get very creative with it and use the same cutters that you're using for the cookie for the fondant. But royal icing works just as well. If you're using royal icing, traditional royal icing is egg whites and powdered sugar. That's it. It is a raw egg product, though, so people with compromised immune systems should not eat raw egg. You can find in a product called meringue powder, and that will replace the egg whites, and it works very well. You do not need very much of it. You do need a lot of powdered sugar, so it's like 1/4 cup of meringue powder to 6 cups of powdered sugar, and about, depending on how much flowage you want on your royal, 1/4 cup to a cup of water. So the less water you have in that, the more firm it's going to be. The more water you have in that, the more flow you will have. And who's watched those videos online where people decorating with all the royal? It's fascinating to watch, and I don't want to eat them because they're works of art. They're beautiful. And I don't have patience for that. I am not a cookie artist. That's not what we do. But you can do that at home and you can practice. They have little tiny pastry bags and they just go to town on it. But that takes a lot of practice. And when they're showing you those videos, those things take several hours to make one cookie. So just be aware that they've compressed that time together, and they're not showing you how long it takes because they have to let the royal icing dry before they move on to another color, so that it doesn't flow together. So, sugar cookies do have a very firm texture. Again, you don't want to go too thick on rolling them out. They're generally going to be milder in flavor, typically just vanilla. Sometimes you could add spice, nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, but fairly light on that so that it doesn't get overpowered or by the frosting, because you want a nice combination on that. Any questions on cutouts? Yeah.
Have you ever used aquafaba for royal icing?
Not for royal icing. I've used it to make a meringue before. The question was if I used aquafaba for royal. I don't know that you could. With enough powdered sugar, you probably could, but it would require, I would reduce the aquafaba first and then make the meringue and then add the powdered sugar to it to get the consistency that you're looking for and adjust with water.
Would it taste funny?
Yeah. Yeah, it'll taste like garbanzos. Yeah. Although the sweet would probably overpower that. They might be too sweet. So, I don't know. I'll have to play with that. Yeah.
You said you were going to tell us how you make your own tinted sugars.
Yep, that's a
This
great
or
question.
with the
Nope, I'll do it right now because it's super easy. So, get a bowl, put some sugar in it, and then any gel food color, couple drops, and with a gloved hand or a spoon or something, just stir. You could put it in a Ziploc bag with a couple of drops and shake. And shake 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 and shake. And then you get whatever color intensity you want. And however much you want. So you could do just a little bit of one color, or you could do a lot of one color. That also works for coloring coconut. So like at Easter, if you're doing like chicks or bunnies, you could do the same thing with a gel color with coconut and color it and then use it for whatever you'd like. But that's the way, because you don't need to buy it. Because they use really weird other things. It's not just sugar and food color, which I've never understood. Any other questions on cutouts? We've got I didn't talk about it, but a much smoother texture, again, because you're rolling it nice and smooth. It's crisp, but it's not going to be like brittle. And you know, there's a softness to it because, again, it's going to be about probably that thick. And they do tend to last quite a while. And they last a little bit longer because there's not as much fat in them, and they're fairly dry to begin with. I wouldn't go beyond 2 weeks. That might chip a tooth. But they wouldn't last that long in my house anyway. I'd eat them. All right. The dough does need to be chilled. I touched on this a second ago, so that it has to be, bring it out and let it get semi-warm before you start rolling. Don't roll it cold. And then whatever season you want. We did some Halloween cookie decorating kits with ghosts and witches' hats and pumpkins. Of course, it's Christmas. Do 4th of July. I mean, even a circle could be like a beach ball in summer, right? Like you could do whatever you want, however creative you want to be. And again, there's thousands of cutouts. The cake place I was telling you about has 3 walls of cookie cutouts. Some this big, some this big. Who knows what a pressed cookie is? Back in the day, there was a thing called a spritz. And it was, I think they're still around. They're a pain in the neck. They're open on both ends. They've got a screw end. And you put a die, like a flat piece of metal with a cutout in it on one end. And then you shove cookie dough in the other end. And then there's a plunger attachment that goes on that end, that screws on that end. And you press the plunger so that the cookie dough presses through the die into whatever shape it was. Like a wreath, typically. Something round, something fairly simple. And they almost never work. I don't know why Gran had one of those. They're good cookies, but they almost never work. The trick to making them work is to have a frozen sheet pan so that as you press the dough onto it, the dough sticks to because it's frozen. And you also have to have the right consistency of dough, which is really difficult to get because you've just shoved it into this metal can. They're not very much fun. Stick with piped. They're also fairly complicated, but like macarons. But the top tree, those are a spritz cookie. And that's the shape the die cutout was. So the one next to it is, I'm assuming, a Viennese butter cookie. And that's a piped cookie. The dough goes into something, and then is pushed out. So in the case of the macaron, it's a fairly soft batter. Again, if you were here for that class last week, you saw it was a fairly soft batter. But that cookie up there looks fairly firm, doesn't it? So depending on the cookie consistency, you need some fairly strong arms to push that out. So you guys got to be aware of that. Churros, you didn't realize churros were a piped cookie. Technically, it's pressed. It goes through a die. It's a much softer dough, and then it goes into a fryer, and then cinnamon sugar. Love those. So the soft, pliable dough is a little misleading because, again, that top one is fairly firm, and then the macaron batter is fairly soft. Intricate shapes and designs depending on how skilled you are with a pastry bag. If you're not very skilled with a pastry bag, practice. That's the only way to get skilled with it, is to continuously practice, practice, practice. Delicate and crisp because they tend to be smaller. They tend to be higher in fat. And what do I mean by fat? Butter. One of the other four-main food groups for me. Decorative potential is whatever you want. So typically in something like this, there'd be a fruit preserve in the middle. Sometimes a chocolate, sometimes like a lemon frosting in the middle. But they also tend to bake fairly quickly. Like macarons is 12 minutes. That's it. That's about the same for most of these. Now, what are these? Ladyfingers. They're a pain in the butt to pipe, but they're so good. Anybody have fresh, not out of a package, ladyfingers? Oh, you're missing out. The batter is very similar to macaron batter, so it's a fairly soft, very mushy batter. And piping them consistently takes a lot of practice and skill. You could cheat horribly or work smarter, not harder, and put it in a sheet and then just cut it. But who's ever had tiramisu? Ladyfingers, right? Soaked in espresso. Really tasty if you like coffee, right? But those are pressed and or piped cookies. Yeah. Any questions on those? Rolled. Now, how is this different than a cutout cookie? Because those are rolled too, aren't they? Well, this means that the final dough is rolled into a log of some sort. So it's not just it's not just rolled out flat and then cut. So who's ever had arugula? Great cookies. Traditional is a poppy filling. That's a rolled cookie. Or a date pinwheel, or the cookie you see down here that's got the layers on it rolled together. That's what I mean by a rolled cookie. It's flat and then layered, great patterns, filled like the arugula, requires it, you have to chill it so that it holds its shape. It doesn't necessarily have to be like an ice box in terms of the shape, right? Because those aren't, and neither are these. But like date pinwheels, those are the ones that we did, because you have your filling, you have your cookie, then your date paste that goes on it, you roll it into a log, and then you slice it, and then that's what you bake, right? Yummy. Wafers. Now, this is a pretty wide category, and there's a lot of cookies that are wafer cookies. Anybody ever have a stroopwafel? They're so good. How about twill? Twills are so easy to make, and I think I have a picture on the next page. But the one that most of us are used to is this top, the vanilla wafers, right? That's the one most of us have seen. But the pirouettes, the ones down in the bottom corner, are also a wafer cookie because they are wafer thin. They are always crisp. They are never chewy. even with a filling, because the filling on the vanilla wafer, that doesn't make them chewy. They're still really crispy. They still snap. They still have a bite to them. Especially the stroopwafel. Sometimes they like fall apart into pieces. They're thin and crispy, light and airy, layered with fillings or not. They don't have to be. Versatile shapes and sizes, and they're generally baked in a special press, like the stroopwafel or the pizzelles, right? Those are very specific. The other one that I just realized is a rosette. It's a really thin batter that gets dipped. It's hot oil. It's an iron that goes from the oil to that and then back into the oil. That's a cookie. It's considered a wafer cookie because it is so thin. Brandy snaps, twill, chocolate wafers. These down here on the bottom are twill. And these are very thin batter, laid out in spoonfuls with almonds sprinkled on top and then baked for like 6 minutes. And when they come out, they're put over something like a rolling pin to get that shape. Sometimes they're brushed with chocolate, sometimes they're not. Very good. But all cookies generally share these characteristics. Crispy, chewy, soft, moist, crunchy, sandy. Now, these cookies, right, how yummy do those look? Those are going to be very chewy. Those are probably gluten-free, and they're like little brownies. And then the ones on top, that's actually puff pastry. That's called a palmier. And palmiers are incredibly versatile. Lots of sugar. I remember one pastry chef, when I was making them, kept yelling at me, "More sugar." And I was like, okay, more sugar. And then you could change the flavors up. Throw in some cinnamon, throw in some nutmeg, throw in some cardamom. Love cardamom. It's one of my favorites. All right, so let's take a look. So how do we get those consistencies, right? How do we get those textures? Well, by how we mix it. Some of it is the ingredients, but again, it's this many ingredients and this many ways to do something with it. Because you could have the same 4 basic ingredients: flour, sugar, butter, eggs. Is it a chocolate chip cookie or is it a brownie? How you mix it and the proportions, the ratio of the ingredients, is the determining factor. So the creaming method is one of the critical things for all drop cookies. So if it's a drop cookie, if it's a roll cookie, if it's a press or a piped cookie, the creaming is going to be the critical point to that. If you overcream your cookie, you'll get what I call a cookie pancake. If you undercream your cookie, you'll get what I call a cookie lumplet. Who's ever made cookie lumplets? I'll own it. I've made a couple, right? So the creaming is basically what you're doing is you're taking sugar, more sugar, and fat, and you're creaming them together. And as the sugar is gouging into the fat, sugar is a crystal. It's creating an air pocket behind it. And the more you cream, the more air you're incorporating. So if you put fat and sugar in a bowl together and just leave it alone, it will go from a fairly pale yellow to a very almost white consistency, color, because you've incorporated so much air. And depending on what you're going to do with it next will determine if that was the right thing to do or not. Chocolate chip cookies, oatmeal raisin cookies, peanut butter cookies, the standards that we most associate with drop cookies, there's a window about that big between undercreamed and overcreamed. And you don't really know that until it comes out of the oven. which is part of why cookies are so complicated, even though it's a cookie. Everyone gets chocolate chip cookies. How hard could it be? It's pretty hard. So, and that's really the number one thing for cookies is the creaming method.
So are you going to explain how we know when the magic moment is?
No, because I don't know based on the recipe you're using.
Oh.
Unfortunately, to know how much it is the right amount of creaming, it really is the rest of the recipe. Because there are some cookies that you want that really almost white, extra air incorporated creamed method in, and there are some cookies that you don't. And without seeing the specific formula, I have no way of knowing which way that is. I will say for most, again, the chocolate chip, oatmeal raisin, the texture you're looking for is wet sand. So you want all of the butter incorporated in to the sugar, because with both of those, all three of those, you're using a combination of white sugar and brown sugar, typically. And brown sugar has more moisture than white sugar. Why? Molasses. So since it has more moisture, you've got to be really careful to not over cream, because that extra moisture isn't going to effectively absorb the rest of the ingredients, and you'll end up with a cookie pancake. So wet sand to just a little bit of air incorporated in, and you should be okay with chocolate chip, oatmeal raisin, peanut butter, that kind of thing. And I know that probably wasn't very helpful.
So it's the recipe's going to say something like until fluffy, just until fluffy, or just until incorporated, or just until.
Yeah, that's a great point. The formula should say,
Should.
yeah. The hard part is the variables that happened in their kitchen when they wrote the recipe versus the variables in your kitchen when you're making it. And that's part of the complexity that is cookies, which most people think cookies are so simple, but they really are very complicated little things. So we'll assume light and fluffy means fairly incorporated with air. They'll have that color change to go from a pale yellow butter color to an almost white, right? They may tell you a time frame. You know, cream for 3 minutes on 2 on a whatever mixer, right? Try it, and see how it turns out in your kitchen. Most test kitchens is a lab. So when chefs are creating their cookbooks, they're using a lab to write and to perfect the recipes in before they put it in their cookbook. Which is why I found most cookbooks I just get inspiration from and not actually follow the recipe, because I don't have a lab. I have a bakery, and you have a kitchen. So try it. And if it comes out great, do that again. And if it doesn't, then I'll have some tips and tricks later on for you to possibly adjust so that you can make it the way you want it. Because some people like a cakey or chocolate chip cookie. Yeah.
Do you have a preference for a hand mix, a handheld mixer, or a stand counter mixer?
I personally prefer a KitchenAid stand type mixer, just because I'm making 200 at a time, right? For you at home, it's possible to get that creamed texture by hand. It'll take a bit of time, and if you've got the time to do it and want to and have the arm strength, go for it. But there's nothing wrong with beaters either, right? As long as you're getting the results that you want, how you get there works, like whatever you want. But again, I'm typically using my 80-quart mixer, and the stand mixers are 6 to give you a, right? Yeah. Do you have a question? Oh, that was your question? Okay. Yeah. So, and I mean, don't get me. I loved the beaters, right? Like that was part of my favorite thing as a kid, whether it was brownies or chocolate chip cookies. And my team still, like, I am addicted to chocolate chip cookie dough. I can't help it. It's my favorite thing. I'll come right, and because I've done it so long, I know just by tasting the dough and feeling the dough if it's over creamed or not. And the way to help control all of that is, and I'll say this, I'll mention this later on, all your ingredients should be at room temperature. Everything should be at room temperature. That will help control those variables that we talked about.
What is sanding there? I saw cold butter, it stuck out at me.
Well, because sanding is for a specific type of, like a pecan sandy. So it's similar to the pie dough process, but because the texture of the cookie, Mexican wedding cookies, they kind of fall apart because they're so sandy. That's how you get that, is because the cold butter. That one you are actually, and I'm thinking of my pie class that I just had. So with pie dough, you want to encapsulate the flour in fat. But with the sanding method, you want to encapsulate the fat in flour. Did that make sense? Because you want the flakiness, you want that fall apart, crumbly texture in that specific type of cookie. Because it's a Mexican wedding cookie. That's what it is, or a pecan sandy. Sponge. Let's move on to sponge. So, lady fingers, right? That would be a sponge method. And it's a folding. So you generally will use, sometimes you'll separate the eggs and you'll whip the yolk with sugar, and then you whip the white by itself. Then you'll add the dry to the yolk and create a firm, very dry texture, and then fold in the egg whites, the whipped egg whites to that to create a spongish type texture, and that's ladyfingers. That's the same basic method for some sponge cakes. Sanding, we mentioned that. And the rubbed in process, and I'm doing this because that's pretty much what you do. And you're rubbing in the cold butter. Sometimes you'll use some recipes will call for a food processor to do that, but I think that's too fast. I think it also melts the butter because of the friction, and you end up with more of a pressed, rolled dough than a sandy dough for, because the Mexican pecan, you ever make Mexican wedding cookies? They're really, like, you gotta press them together, and they really don't stay together very well. You got to be very careful when you put them on the sheet pan, because the second you put them on there, they tend to break apart. That's just the nature of that cookie because of the fat content in them. So I don't know if that answered your question.
I'm still wrapping my head around coating the sugar with the fat and the flour. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
quite a hands-on thing.
Yeah, it is. And then the one stage is, of course, the easiest. Just put it all in the blender. Yeah.
Which one of those is for a cutout cookie?
Generally, it's going to be either the creaming or the one stage for the cutout cookies. Shortbread cookies would also be a one stage. You can cream. So the formula will tell you what to do, but those are the basic processes. And it depends, because you can do the creaming method for rollouts as well as bar cookies as well as drop cookies. But you wouldn't use a sponge method for a chocolate chip cookie, but you use it for macarons and ladyfingers. You think about, right? Any question? Yeah.
I just had one before you move on.
Yeah.
Maybe I should have asked it a couple minutes ago. What is a lace cookie? One time I made a lace cookie, and that was like unlike anything I had ever made.
Those are considered, Let me go back because I.
Sticky, so.
It's considered a wafer cookie.
Okay.
Yeah. Because there's also sometimes you'll see very fancy pastries have like a piece of lace,
Yeah.
right? Or a really thin something on it. Those are wafer cookies because the batter is very thin and it takes 0 time to cook. And if you do 30 seconds too much, it's gone.
Right.
Yeah, lace cookies are considered wafers. And if again we go back to the twill, right? This is
Roll it around something. Yeah.
yep, yeah. But the batter is very, very thin on both of those. I've seen I get lots of ads for things, and there's it's like a baking mat that has openings in it, and you press the dough into it and bake it, and it creates the lace.
Oh, okay.
But that's cheating. All right, so ingredients. Flour, sugar, butter, eggs, and I mean fat. You could use some other type of fat, but let's be real, butter's better. I think it's a pastry chef's obligation to inject butter any chance they can because it's better for you. And it's butter, y'all. So what are they all doing, right? Like, flour has more than one purpose. Sugar has more than one purpose. One of the first classes that we did here at the library was actually called core baking. It was all about the ingredients. Sugar actually has 6 different functions in baking and pastries. Flour has 5 other functions. Fat has 6 or 7 other functions. Eggs has a lot more functions. So depending on the formula, and you notice I keep using the word formula because that's what these are. These are chemical formulas that you get to enjoy, right? You get to eat and share because that's why we make cookies. So flour is going to be, for the most part, your binding agent. It's going to be what brings together the cookie. So depending on how much flour you have will depend on how much binding you have. So again, imagine a ladyfinger. Those are very light and fluffy, very airy, not much flour. It's also a pastry flour, not an all-purpose flour. So I don't want to go too far into the science of flours, but there's a lot of flour out there, and they all have different protein contents, and depending on the protein content will depend on how much gluten is formed, which will depend on how much texture you get. So you're not making baguette, right? Baguette needs a higher gluten. You need lower gluten. You need cake flour. You need pastry flour. All-purpose flour. You will never, ever, ever use bread flour for cookies, ever. Don't. It won't work. It creates structure. It reduces spread. Now, what the heck is spread? Remember that cookie lumplet versus the cookie pancake I talked about? So not only is creaming a key for that, but so is your flour. So if you've over-creamed it and you have enough flour, it might still hold it together and it not be quite as much of a cookie pancake. But if you don't cream it enough, it absolutely will be a cookie lumplet. It's critical for texture. And this is where, again, brownies, a fudgy brownie versus a cakey brownie. Now, and this is where it gets really interesting because with cookies, like chocolate chip cookies, oatmeal, peanut butter, the more you cream those, you'll get a cookie pancake. The more you cream a brownie, you'll get a cakier brownie. The additional fat from the chocolate in the brownies. And you'll create, and that's fine if you like cakier brownies. So again, the formula will tell you how much to cream, but depending on what texture you're going for, you could end up with 2 completely different textures with the same process. It determines the crispiness, the toughness, and the chewiness. And crispiness, especially if it's a wafer cookie, right? Those are very delicate, very crisp. Sugar, not just sweet. Leavening. How is it leavening? Air. Remember when it's gouging into the fat, creating an air pocket? What happens when you put something with a lot of air in a hot environment? That air is going to expand. There's your leavening. And so that's when you're using it with fat. Well, what happens if you use it with eggs? Macarons. When you create a meringue, you're creating the lift. So sugar is really one of the more complicated things out there. Leavening, it creates texture. Again, spread. If you don't get the meringue right on the macaron, or you don't get the creaming right on a chocolate chip cookie, it determines the crispiness and, of course, the sweetness. Fat also is structure, contributor to leavening and spread, creates texture. Some fats are a liquid. I'm going to go back to, oh, there it is. So this chocolate cookie here in the middle was made with melted butter. And I know that because that's the texture that I get when I use melted butter. So a liquid fat. So it doesn't have to be room temperature butter that you cream the sugar in. It could totally be melted. And the recipe will tell you that. The formula will say melted butter, and then you do this with it. Typically, you're going to add cocoa and mix that together, and then follow whatever the rest of the ingredients the recipe says. Crispiness, chewiness, and moistness. And then eggs. Again, leavening, structure, texture, some nutrient, some, because it is eggs. But then is it the whole egg? Is it the egg white? Is it just the egg yolks? Because again, macarons only use the egg whites. But some lace cookies and ladyfingers use more egg yolks. So it just depends on which part you're using. It determines chewiness, moistness, and crispiness. Now, these are the core of the ingredients in cookies. There's thousands of other ingredients that could go into cookies. Baking soda, baking powder, chemical leaveners, right? That's going to give you some lift. Insert favorite spice here, salt. There's a variety of other ingredients, but these are the ones that are really where the cookie is going to get its shape, its flavor, its look, and that's why I just wanted to focus on these four. But there's literally thousands of other ingredients, because you can't have an oatmeal raisin cookie without oatmeal and raisins. Yeah.
Doesn't sugar also relate to moisture? Because I've done some low sugar baking, and the recipes usually have more fat or some kind of
Absolutely.
ingredient to
Yep.
increase the moisture.
Yeah, that's actually the main function of sugar is moistness. Because sugar is hygroscopic, it absorbs moisture from the air around it, and it contributes to moisture and texture in everything, whether it's a cookie or a cake. In fact, I was training a new baker, and we have our NBC cake recipe, which is nothing but chocolate because it's really, really good. And I looked at them, and I was like, these ain't right. And I'm like, try one. And she was like, ugh. I'm like, you forgot sugar. She's like, how could you tell? I said, because they didn't look as moist. And even if I'd caught her soon enough, I could have added the sugar, and it still would have worked because it was a cupcake, but not a cookie. A cookie wouldn't have worked. But yeah, absolutely. So some lower sugar cookies will absolutely have moisture either in butter or oil or eggs or somewhere else to compensate for that. Now, I will caveat sugar really quick since we're still talking about sugar. This only applies to table white granulated sugar. That does not apply. None of those rules apply to anything that's an alternative sugar. Not honey, not maple syrup, not molasses, not stevia, not Splenda, none of those. especially the liquid sugars, because those are liquid sugars. Those have a higher, those are fructoses, so they behave differently than sucrose does. Again, the difference between dextrose and sucrose, the meltability of it. So if you're using and following a formula that uses, say, maple syrup as the sole sweetener, which I've seen plenty of, it's going to behave a lot differently than granulated sugar. And you can't just swap them out. It won't work, ever. Because the sugar is doing a variety of functions, and unless you know which function you're wanting to replace with the sugar, it just won't work. Because if it's just sweetness, Splenda will do that, but Splenda is like 16 times sweeter than sugar because it's a sugar alcohol. Did that answer your question? Yeah. All right, I kind of went on a tangent there. Thanks for letting me hijack your question. All right, any questions on the other ingredients? Yeah.
Does it matter the size of the egg? You know,
Yes.
Jumbo, large?
Absolutely matters. Most American formulas are designed for large eggs, which is typically 2 ounces. You go to the store, you see the extra large or the jumbo. Those are going to be 3 to 5 ounces, and that will throw the whole formula off. So like duck eggs are bigger, quail eggs are not. Don't use quail eggs. They're a pain in the butt. But standard is large. Yep, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that one. All right, here we go. So how do we get the crispiness, softness, the chewiness, and the sandiness? Well, we limit the moisture to get crispiness, which would also mean low sugar. A smaller size, right? So if your cookie is smaller in circumference or thinner, it will be crispier because there's nothing else for it to do but be crispy. Longer bake time. Twice baked. Why on earth would I bake something twice? Who's ever had biscotti? It's baked twice. Hence the name biscotti. And they're very crispy. They also have a fairly high fat content. And they're originally baked in a kind of an oval and then cut and then baked again. Typically that second bake isn't very long, but just enough to dry it out a little bit more and to make it crispier so that when you dunk it into your coffee, that makes it a bit chewier. And American biscotti is way softer than European biscotti. You could Hank Aaron could use European biscotti. It's tough. Because that's what they're used to doing is dunking it in their coffee or their espresso, and then that adds the moisture to it so they don't, they need it drier for that so it doesn't fall off in their coffee. Softness, higher moisture, higher fat, larger, shorter and higher temperature when baked. So a shorter time frame, but at a higher temperature. So instead of 12 minutes at 375, it would be 8 minutes at 425. That higher temperature is going to do a couple things. It's going to evaporate out the moisture faster because it's at a higher temperature. It's also going to set all the proteins faster. So it will be, again, depending on how big it is, because if it's a smaller one, it's still going to be crispy. But if it's bigger, and depending on how it was creamed, right, it would be a bit softer. Chewy, higher sugar, more tougheners. What the heck is a toughener? Flour, cocoa powder. They're also drying agents, so you'd have to account for extra moisture when using those. Longer mix time. That's that creaming I was talking about. And the use of a liquid fat. Again, melted butter. It could be oil. Could be, but melted butter is the way to go. Sandy, more fat, less sugar, less liquid, more egg yolks. Again, the Mexican wedding cookies. Proper mix of fat and flour, that forsage, that sanding together that I was talking about. That's the critical component to a sandy cookie. And I do like pecan sandies. I like Mexican wedding cookies. Those are really good. Any questions on those characteristics and how to get them? All right, so when cookies go wrong, it's going to be more than likely one of these reasons. So if it's too tough, we'll take the too tough category first. Wrong or too much flour was used. So the second caveat to my all ingredients should be room temperature when you begin, all ingredients should be weighed. Invest in a scale. They're not that expensive. I think like 20 bucks on Amazon. Sur La Table, they're a little bit more expensive, but it's right here in town. Meijer even has scales. I think an OXO scale that goes up to like 11 pounds, I want to say is like 30 bucks.
Okay, but a lot of recipes don't tell you the weight.
They don't. Yeah, a lot of recipes don't, which is unfortunate. And in as many cookbooks as I have, and as much as I love them, and my girlfriend will shoot me square between the eyes if I get any more cookbooks, don't buy it. If it doesn't have both volume and weight, your chances of success are less. Because there's a very big difference between volume and weight. Right? When I was teaching culinary arts at Washtenaw Community College, my favorite class to teach was bakery science because I'm a geek. First day of class, we'd go through the roll. Yes, everybody's supposed to be here. Yes, this is the right class. And I'd ask my students, which weighs more, a ton of bricks or a ton of feathers? And I would have one student every year, bricks. And I'd have to explain the difference between a ton of bricks and a ton of feathers. It's still a ton, right? A ton is a ton. It's just how much of it, right? The difference between density, mass, volume. It all matters. And believe it or not, flour has different densities, whether it's cake flour, pastry flour, all-purpose flour. Flour has more density than cake and pastry because it has more gluten, less starch. Those two have more starch. So weighing your ingredients, you will always be more successful because you will be more accurate. You're controlling the variables. So that's what I mean by too much. Or wrong. Again, if it called for all-purpose, you can't use self-rising. You can't use bread flour. It won't work. Not enough fat. So the recipe calls for a stick of butter. Do they mean 4 ounces or do they mean 5 ounces? And was your stick of butter actually weighed 4 ounces? Because I've put a pound of butter on a scale and it's 15.7 ounces, which I know 0.3 doesn't sound like a lot, but when I'm doing 10 pounds of butter in something and each one is off by about half an ounce, that throws the whole ratio off. For you guys at home, it probably won't matter that much. But for, a professional, it does, because it does add up. Mixed too long. Now, why would it be too tough if it's mixed too long? I'm not talking about creaming. I'm talking about the final, all the ingredients mixed together. So everything's in there, and you just keep mixing it. Like the doorbell rang, and you went to answer it. Oh, my goodness, I left the mixer on. It's going to be too tough because you've overworked the gluten, and it'll just be tough. Not enough sugar, because sugar, again, leads to spread, moisture, all the things we talked about already. Too crumbly, improper mixing. So whether it was the sanding, the getting the butter and sugar I mean, so the butter and flour together, or it was not mixing it long enough. If you have too much sugar, it would be too crumbly. If you have too much leavening, baking soda, baking powder. Not enough eggs, because it's too dry, right? Too much spread, so the cookie pancake, improper creaming, not measured properly, or just the ratio itself is off. And there's a couple of cookbooks out there that I've tried a couple of recipes from, and they never work. I don't use those recipes again. Again, I go back for inspiration and ideas on something, but there's a lot of them that just won't work. Whether it was they were in Denver at their lab making it, which makes a very big difference, or their lab was somewhere completely there's so many factors that go into all of this that they just don't work. Not enough spread, improper creaming, ingredients not measured properly, the ratio is off, the wrong flour is used. Too hard, overbaked, wrong flour, ratio, oven temp too high. So sugary surface, mixed improperly, ratio is off, too much sugar. I think you're seeing a theme with this, which is basically follow the recipe. You'll be more successful. What I would do if I have a cookbook that only has volume measurements, I'd weigh them. And if it came out the way I wanted it to, I would note that as I weighed it, and I would go by the weight measurements. Because just because you scooped a 5-ounce cup of flour for whatever this time doesn't mean you will next time. But if you use weight measurements, you will be more accurate. Because 8 ounces is not always a cup. Did y'all know that? Very rarely is 8 ounces a cup. In fact, in baking and pastries, there's only 3 ingredients where 8 ounces is a cup. That's water, heavy cream, and milk. And what do those 3 things have in common? The viscosity is the same. Their density is the same. And dry ingredients should never, ever be just because I'm going to go on a tangent for a second, and I apologize. There's that whole sifted cup or a cup sifted, right? And this kind of goes with that ton of bricks, ton of feathers thing. Because there's a difference between 10 pounds of onions diced and 10 pounds of diced onions. Because if you go to the store and you buy a 10-pound bag of onions, you have to trim the edges off, then you peel the skin off, and then you dice it. You end up with about 7.5 pounds of onions diced. So you'd need about 13 pounds of onions to get 10 pounds of onions diced. See what I mean? So it's the same thing with a cup of flour. Is it a cup sifted or is it a sifted cup? I ain't got time for that. And a lot of times people will say you scoop your cup of flour and you take a knife or something and then scrape across. No, don't do that. Because what are you doing when you put the knife on it? You're compacting it. That changes the amount in the cup. Because the flour at the bottom of your container is more compact than the flour at the top of your container. Which is why it doesn't matter how compact it is if you weigh it. It's always going to, if you weigh out a pound, it will be a pound. No matter what, it will be a pound. There's a saying, and I don't remember all of it, a pint's a pound all the world round or something like that. I don't know if that's true or not, but, right? But a pound is a pound. So weigh your ingredients. And don't worry about that sifted cup or a cup sifted. If that tells you, if that's in your formula, put the book back. Just don't even get it.
Another question. I made muffins today. It called for oil. I had oil, but when I opened it up, I wasn't quite sure if it was starting to smell bad. So I had shortening, vegetable shortening. I Googled it real quick to see if I could
No.
Tasted okay, but those weren't cookies, so.
Yeah. So muffins are a quick bread, so you've got a little bit more flexibility with that, just given the nature of what a quick bread is. But for a cookie, absolutely not, because shortening actually has an ingredient added in it that most people don't think about, and that's air. Because if you think about why it's white, it's creamed.
If you melt it,
Right, so if you melt it and use a weight measurement, you'll probably be okay. But if you used a cup, like a dry cup, and then melted that, it wasn't a cup when you melted it, was it?
no, but I melted it enough to get what I needed.
Right.
Yeah, shortening doesn't.
Right, because it's creamed.
Yeah.
That's why it's white and fluffy, is air is incorporated into it. So you can't just take a cup of it and melt it and use that. So I'm glad you did more to get the amount you needed. Yeah. And for a quick bread, like I said, that will probably be okay, but not for a cookie. Yeah.
How does coconut oil relate in terms of either shortening or butter?
Not at all. Because coconut butter or coconut fat is such a low melt point, like it melts at like 89 degrees, it's not versatile enough for any baking and pastries unless the formula is specifically designed for coconut.
So you can't substitute coconut.
You cannot substitute coconut for butter, butter for coconut back and forth. It won't work. Because again, the melt point is different, the amount of moisture is different, the fat content is different. It just won't work. There are specially formulated cookie recipes and bread recipes and cake recipes for coconut that will work because the ratios take into account the properties of the coconut. Yeah, do you have a question? Okay, all right. Any other questions on when cookies go wrong? So I've talked about a couple of these. All ingredients must be at room temperature. And I don't care what you're making, bread, quick breads, cookies, pie dough, scones, biscuits, I don't care. Everything should be at room temperature. And I get the strangest looks when I include pie dough in that. Because everybody goes on and on and on about cold butter and pie dough, and it's hogwash. It's a flat-out lie. I get so mad about it because I love pie. Sorry, I had to just throw that one in. Use a scale to measure ingredients. You've kind of gone over that one. Don't improvise. Right? Yeah.
When you're using the scale to measure, do you have a container for each individual ingredient, or do you add them to the other one when you're measuring?
That's a great question. So if you didn't hear, the question was when you're weighing your ingredients out, do you have a container for each individual ingredient, or is there another way to do it? And every scale I have ever seen comes with a button called tare. So you turn it on, you put your bowl on it, and you hit the tare button. And you add your flour. And you hit the tare button again, and then you add your baking soda, your baking powder, your spices. Now, depending on the type of formula it is, you may add the sugar, because in some formulas the sugar is a dry, and in some formulas the sugar is a wet. And it will tell you, right? And then you go from there. So use the tare button. That way, because I hate dishes. Like I hate doing dishes. My dishwasher in the bakery runs in 90 seconds, and I still hate dishes. Tare button's the way to go. But when I'm doing a class, I of course have everything scaled out because it's showing what's going on. But yeah, weight measurements. So don't improvise. And what I mean by that is, don't just, oh yeah, that'll work. It won't. It really won't. Cookies are the second most complicated baking and pastry thing to make. Second only to bread. And bread is the most complicated because it only has 3 ingredients. And the fewer the ingredients, the more complex the process. And cookies have a lot of ingredients, right? There's flour, sugar, butter, eggs, baking soda, baking oats, raised like chocolate chips. There's all kind of ingredients in it. The issue is because it's such complex chemistry going on, to get the consistency that you want in a chocolate chip cookie is actually very difficult to do, especially on a consistent basis. Because there are so many variables that go into making these little yummy cookies. And who doesn't love a chocolate chip cookie? Like, I'm not sure I could trust you if you don't. And so that's what I mean by don't improvise. Now, you can, like if you've got a sugar cookie or roll-out sugar cookie, improvise your little heart out with the flavors. All right? Cinnamon, nutmeg, cardamom, ginger, cayenne, like whatever. As long as it's a flavoring. Now, cocoa is not a flavoring. Cocoa is a drying agent. And I've had a lot of people ask me, well, can I just make chocolate macarons with adding cocoa? No. It won't work. Because the chemistry of cocoa is so different and complex in and of itself that you have to account for that. So depending on what you want to do with your roll-out sugar cookie, you could change the flavor in terms of vanilla versus ginger. But you can't just make a chocolate roll-out cookie by adding cocoa. It won't work. You need to increase moisture somehow, either in fat or in eggs or in sugar, because those 3 things contribute to moisture. Yeah?
So you should not take the eggs right out of the refrigerator and put them
No.
in. I've done that for
Nope.
How long do you recommend setting the eggs out for?
Overnight. We leave our butter out at room temperature all the time. And we pull flats because we go through 50 to 60 dozen eggs a week. So we go through a lot of eggs. So we actually pull the flats out the night before that we're going to use the next day. So when I get back to the bakery tonight, I'll pull out 5 flats of eggs because we're making cookies tomorrow.
Let's say you didn't plan ahead that well.
Put them in hot water and gently bring them. I'm not saying like hot enough for you to touch still, but just gently bring them up to temperature. And honestly, you could probably get away with it like an hour. Yeah, but cold eggs, because they take longer to do whatever it is you want to do. They also crack and split easier when they're at room temperature. Pay attention to the mixing method. Again, the formula will tell you, it might not say you're using the creaming method or the whatever, right? The sanding method, the sponge method. It won't tell you that that's what's happening. But whatever the process is, follow that. Because again, whether you want a cakey brownie or a fudgy brownie is the mixing. Whether you get a cookie lumplet or a cookie pancake is the mixing. So pay attention to that part of it. But most of all, have fun. Because they're cookies, y'all. Cookies are fun. Any questions on my tips and tricks? All right. Any questions on anything at this point?
What's your favorite cookie?
Chocolate chip. Yeah. I don't. But I did just release an e-recipe book on my website. So if you go to lakehouse.bakery.com, you'll see a spot to sign up and get the free recipe ebook that has chocolate chip cookies in there.
Are chocolate chip cookies an American cookie?
It is. Yep, straight up American cookie. The Toll House, actually, that is the real legend. Like that really happened. It was an inn. I don't remember where, but it was the Toll House Inn. And she was making cookies. There were guests, and I don't remember the specifics about it, but something happened, and the chocolate chips got dumped into it, and chocolate chip cookies were born. Another side, really fun trivia about chocolate chips. Chocolate chips are actually designed not to melt and lose their shape when heated. Because if you've ever noticed in a chocolate chip cookie, it gets baked and the chips still come out like chips. They're the only ones that's designed to do that. Because every other type of chocolate just melts and becomes a blob. Yeah, but yeah, straight up American. Yeah.
So for some cookies, I would like to cut down the sugar. What should I do? So you mean I just
Don't, more sugar, he said. More sugar.
No, what if I don't like this? It's too sweet. I want to cut down a little bit. No.
Yeah, some
Find a different recipe. Yeah, because you're changing the ratio, which will change the texture, it'll change the moisture, it'll change the crispiness. It won't just reduce the sweetness. Because sweet is only one function of sugar, and that's actually the least thing that it does. The texture and moisture content are the two bigger things that it does. So if you just pull even a quarter of the sugar out, you're dramatically changing the ratio of the other ingredients. And that's how because again, it's, with baking, you've got this many ingredients and this many ways to do something with it. And if you change the ratio of the ingredients and how they go together, you're completely changing the chemistry of that cookie, and it won't work.
So if I have like all-purpose flour, but I want to use like a whole wheat flour, no, I want to be healthier, like healthier ingredients. No.
No, especially, yeah. So, and again, in that specific case, whole wheat flour absorbs additional moisture. So you'd have to change something else because you can't just replace. It won't work. It absolutely is a chemical formula. And people kind of get put off by that, but it is, baking is chemistry. Cooking is too, but with cooking you've got more flexibility, right? You've got, like if you oversalt your soup, you can throw in potatoes, and that will help cut the salt in whatever that soup was, right? But you can't do that with baking and pastries because the chemistry won't work. And there's actually there's classes all over on baking chemistry, and that was my favorite class to teach because I'm a geek about it. That's what I love about baking and pastries, is taking 4 very humble, simple ingredients and creating everything from a chocolate chip cookie to a ladyfinger. And how I change, what I do differently is the ratio of the ingredients and how I put them together. And you can't just swap stuff out. It won't work. You can find recipes that use whole wheat flour and that have been designed to use that flour. The Moosewood Collective, it's been around for 50 years. That's the top one off my head that tends to be a bit healthier. But you can find recipes and cookbooks specifically designed that are healthier. And I say that in air quotes because if you buy it in a store and it says it's healthier, chances are it's not. Because if they're taking something out, they got to put something back in to make it still palatable and flavorful and the texture that we want and that we're used to. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions? I like to add nuts to cookies, and I'm a fan of like walnuts and things. Do you have any suggestions? Like, should you toast them first? Anything?
Absolutely. Toast them first. And just for a few minutes. 350, 375 oven on a sheet pan flat, a thin layer. Toast them 10 minutes-ish until you start to smell that nuttiness come out. And then absolutely let them cool down to room temperature. And then throw them in, absolutely. Now, if you're doing it in, say, a tuile, that'll change the texture of the tuile. And you'd want to do that after, right, the very end. But chocolate chip, oatmeal raisin, peanut butter, snickerdoodle, go for it. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
What if with a oatmeal cookie you were to take the oats and grind them into flour rather than just the whole oat? You know, like
It won't work.
with that.
More sugar.
Yeah, yeah. I see where you're going, but it won't work because you've created more surface area, right? It's still just oats, but because you've cut it into smaller pieces, you've created more surface area for which the oats to absorb the moisture. Because oats are spongy, right? If you put oats in water and let them soak up the water, they become spongy, right? So imagine taking a sponge and cutting it up to a piece. It's going to absorb more moisture, and you'd have to adjust for that in the formula. And it's weird. It's the chemistry of baking. Any other questions? Yeah.
When you publish your cookbook, I think I have a title for you. It won't work.
I like that. That's good. That's really good. All right, so if that's all you've got for questions for me, I've got some oatmeal raisin cookies for you.